This is Annie, and today we're going to be jumping into life and learning here with Kobe and Mr. Mike Cook. They're going to be discussing the future of journalism in our community, as well as some storytelling. Take it away, Kobe.
Thanks, Annie, and thank you too, Kellen, for introducing us.
No problem.
Mike Cook, it's nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Thank you for having me here.
All right. So can you tell us what you do?
I am the one and only staff writer for the Las Cruces Bulletin, which is the weekly newspaper here in Las Cruces.
Nice.
Wow, that's really cool.
So cool.
It is. I'm very lucky to have the job, and I try to be grateful for it every single day because I get to write for a living.
How long have you been doing this?
I started part-time about 4.5 years ago.
And what about now? Are you like going full-time now, or are you still...
Yes. Yeah, I'm full-time, have been for about 3.5 years, I think.
Wow, you've got a lot of experience in this then.
I've gotten to tell a lot of stories, a lot of different things. I should go back and count stories. I do. It varies from week to week, but I probably do 10 or 15 stories a week, sometimes more than that. And that sounds more impressive than it really is because sometimes they're pretty short. But it's a lot of words and a lot of stories on a lot of very different things going on, a lot of very interesting people in Las Cruces.
So, what is it that you like to write? You said you like telling stories, but what exactly does that entail?
I think of myself as a storyteller, much more than a journalist. That's what I like to do, is tell people stories. I don't really have a particular beat. The one I always think of, I remember when I was a little kid and I watched a football game on television, and there was Charlie Johnson, who was the quarterback of the St. Louis Cardinals in those days, and Charlie Johnson was an NMSU graduate. And so when I went to work for the Bulletin, I tracked him down because he's used to be head of the chemistry department at NMSU, and did a story with him. And Charlie Johnson has a big old gold and diamond ring on his right hand because he's a member of the Denver Broncos Ring of Honor, because he was the first Denver Broncos quarterback that had a winning record. And my ego
you Broncos fans.
Yeah. My ego was like, wow, I get to sit here and tell this guy's story. And lots of people have talked to Charlie Johnson, but it's still one of the coolest things I ever did in my life. That's the kind of thing, there's just an amazing story to me, and I got to tell it.
Yeah, not a lot of people experience that. So
right.
I would feel the same way you do, too.
And
he's like a legend. So.
The kindest, gentlest, most wonderful man to talk to. We had a great lunch, and I'll never forget it as long as I live.
Wow. It sounds like you met like a legend there.
Yes.
So I also know that I also learned from out there from before we started recording that you don't just write like stories. You also do poems. Mm-hmm. You were telling me about this really interesting poem about dragons you did for your sister.
Yeah, I don't know that nobody's read it but me and my sister, and I don't know if it would qualify as interesting. But my sister lives in Colorado, and we talk on the phone virtually every night, and we've had both, especially my sister, this longtime interest in dragons, dragon energy, whatever you want to call it, because they probably exist only in mythology. But she's very, very interested in them, and so I'd been thinking about it. It was stirring in my mind about writing something about it, and I just finally sat down and wrote a poem about dragons and sent it to her.
That's I've always been a big fan of dragons. It's one of those things ever since I was a little kid. Ever since I was a little kid about them, I just always really liked them. But so what else do you like to write?
I've written a couple of short plays. I did one last April for community theater. I have for about 45 years I've been interested in Jack the Ripper, and so I wrote a short play about one of the policemen, and I played him, and a friend of mine played kind of an amalgamation of Jack the Ripper's victims, and the audience seemed to like it. I know I did. I had a great time with it. So I have in my head a longer version of that play to write. I haven't done it yet, but I guess I tend to see the world from a writer's perspective. So, I mean, I don't do it all the time, but that's kind of my view of everything. that's how my brain works, and so I write a lot of different things.
Now, you have this extensive history of doing all these different kinds of writings. How did you end up writing for the Bulletin?
I worked for the school district here in Las Cruces for close to 10 years, and when I quit, the publisher of the Bulletin, Richard Coltharp, offered me a job, and I took it, and as I said, I started part-time, and about 4.5 years later, I'm still doing it.
Wow. You it sounds a little bit like fate. You just you meet him during this other completely other job, and
right.
And it sounds like you really love doing this too.
I really do. When I worked for the school district 9.5 years, I wrote about 11,000 news releases. And that sounds like a big deal. Some of them were 5 lines long.
Yeah.
But I got to tell a lot of stories about little kids, older kids, teachers, staff members, just amazing people who have these incredible stories that, they didn't play in the NFL. They're not multimillionaires, but you talk to teachers and you can feel their love for what they're doing, the impact that they have had and continue to have on kids, and just everybody's got a story to tell. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you run across them and it's just like, wow, this is just amazing.
Those are the superheroes right there.
Yeah.
People don't realize it. So
there are teachers that I've had ever since kindergarten that have changed my life, that if I never had them, I would not be the person I am today, and I am so thankful to them.
Oh, it's incredible. You just get to tell that story and from their perspective, wow. Yeah, there's nothing like it.
Now, some of the youth today feel like they don't have a particularly strong public voice, and as someone who generally speaks to the public on a regular basis, do you have any advice to help strengthen their voice to be able to help shout it out to the people around them?
Wow, that's a very rich question. That's probably
I'm premium, that's why.
There you go. You are indeed. That's probably better expressed on social media, which I'm not. I'm on Facebook, but I'm 62 years old, and that's, I'm kind of a different generation, and it's still kind of new and unusual to me. I'm much more about the written word in terms of newspapers and, holding something in my hand, kind of what's passing away. But I guess my advice would be, and that's one of the values of journalism, of being able to write, know what it is you want to express. You don't have to be able to say in 2 sentences, this is my opinion, but don't just be a loud voice. Have something meaningful to say that other people will want to hear. There's lots of media out there that are available. Newspapers certainly still. Every place I go, there's a possibility to do a story. I think you and I are going to do a story on what you're working on. Everybody's a potential story, so don't be afraid to suggest that to a journalist. There's also letters to the editor. You can write an opinion editorial. Sometimes both the Sun News, the Daily, and the Bulletin look for quality op-eds about a whole range of different topics. So there's ways to connect. You just have to look for them.
Well, I'm personally happy to hear that. It's always nice to hear that. Being able to speak one's opinion out there, and it's people who speak them typically have something to say, and it's good to hear that other people are listening to it.
Yeah, we're kind of in a place politically and socially, I guess, you certainly hear it all the time, of division. There's a left and a right. We've kind of moved away from the center. Reasonable voices that express an opinion, but they're listening to what other people have to say. That's very valuable in this day and age. I don't think it matters what age or what generation you are.
Now, your role in journalism, how do you feel that journalism has a role in terms of one's civic duty?
I think there's an important duty to tell stories. A lot of newspapers, the Bulletin is more feature-oriented because it's a weekly, but there's a journalistic necessity, I think, to almost an adversarial relationship to some degree to cover what governmental entities are doing, the city, the county, elected officials, like school boards. It's more and more difficult, I think, all across the country because newspapers are shrinking because there's so much more interest in social media. We talked about that. More and more people are getting their news from social media, but newspapers are still, I think, incredibly relevant. I really think that's the word because they will cover, especially in detail, things you may not be able to find anyplace else, and that's important.
No, definitely.
Right, definitely.
Especially people who may not, I know the whole social media realm is kind of taking over, but there's still people who don't even want a computer or they don't want to deal with any electronics. They live off the grid and stuff, so they might want to read a newspaper and get their information that way. So
absolutely. I spent a couple hours yesterday with Tony Dorman, who is the CEO, the founder of Electronic Caregiver. That's the tower downtown, and this is the absolute cutting edge of healthcare. And one of the most fascinating people I have ever met in my life started this, I don't even know how many years ago, a dozen or 15. The company was started in 2009, and it's right here in Las Cruces. And I got to talk to him in depth. I don't know the length of the story I'm going to write, but it'll be several hundred words at least, and I can go in some depth about his history, and they're presenting at a couple of trade shows, international trade shows, and I can talk about a little more about where their technology is in a newspaper than I might be able to with some other media source where there's a much more limited space.
Now, we've been talking a lot about social media lately. What do you think the future of journalism is going to be like in this age where that's kind of dominated all other forms of information?
I think certainly the trend that you're seeing is newspapers connecting with social media, not competing, but successful newspapers are online. And you can also print a hard copy, but I think if you ignore the trend, which is social media, you'll fail. Clearly, the trend is multiple newspapers being owned by the same chain. Because as we discussed, you can have one printing press that does X number of newspapers and combine a lot of the staff. So I think that's going to continue. But I think newspapers will survive, but it's in flux. It's like everything else. It's in the process of changing, and newspapers are sort of covering their own story, which is an interesting thing to do as well. But if you ignore the trend, you'll fail. So you have to become a part of it.
I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think to ignore any kind of massive trend or flow in this terms of information is leading yourself to be sank and washed away. It's all about having to be able to adapt to the new environments that you're growing into.
Absolutely. And people, it's easy to forget. You read a newspaper, you think it's about stories, and it certainly is. But newspapers are businesses. And if they don't make a profit or at least figure out a way to break even, they don't exist. They fail. So you've got to look at it from that perspective as well, that we got to make this a successful business or we're going to go under.
Yeah. And what's worse, being not doing the stories you want or not being able to do any stories?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a whole broad perspective of the whole thing to make it successful in a bunch of different ways and keep it relevant.
Oh, well, I really appreciate you coming to talk with us today. You've given us a lot of very interesting information, and if I'm being totally honest, completely new stuff to me because I don't read. I'm not sure I've ever read a newspaper. If I'm being totally honest,
and you're not alone at all. Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to tell the story.
Yeah. All right, Kellen,
what's going on? Well, I appreciate you guys definitely.